What I have here is a 2019 MacBook Pro. This is the 16-inch model. A couple years back, this machine would have been an absolute dream of mine to buy, and it was. But at the price that it was when it came out, impossible for me. But now, I picked it up for about $400, and to specifically make this video and benchmark macOS, the default, obviously, operating system that comes with it, Windows, and Linux. I love doing these kind of benchmark videos, and this is the first time I've been able to kind of throw macOS in the bunch. And to be quite frank, some of the results were surprising. I did think Apple would do a lot better on their own hardware, but as you're going to see in this video, it's definitely mixed. But before I get into some raw numbers, we're going to start with just the traditional boot speed test. For this, the timing started as soon as my finger was released from the power button. And here we have a little side-by-side to see exactly when these things do fire up. And actually, Windows was the quickest to boot on this machine at 23 seconds, followed up very closely by Ubuntu at 25 seconds. And then finally, after thinking about it for a while, macOS booted up in 29 seconds. This starting from a complete powered off state. Now, I'm somebody who finds myself rebooting my systems more than I do shutting them down. So for this test, starting from when I clicked on restart, we had a little switch up with Ubuntu booting at 29 seconds, Windows rebooting at 31 seconds, and macOS rebooting at 36 seconds. And I was quite surprised, even with the reboot speed, that macOS didn't get closer or beat out one of these other operating systems, especially considering it's their own hardware. Now, before we dive into everything else, battery life, CPU benchmarking, and things like that, I do need to give a minute to thank our sponsor, Skillshare. I have been wanting to up my skills in things I do every day within my home lab. I've recently finished up the Coding Python 101 for Beginners course, and it has been incredibly helpful with some of the things I've been doing. And now I plan on getting into some more advanced things such as the TPC socket programming, and I've yet to do project management classes, which is something I need to do. You probably already know this, but Skillshare is one of the largest learning communities online led by industry experts across film, design, freelance photography, and more. Skillshare can help take your career skills, passions, hobbies, side projects to the next level. I've been using it here and there because it is my duty to expand my personal skill and knowledge so I can better serve you guys. And better yet, the first 500 people to click the link down below will get a free 1-month trial to Skillshare to check out, explore, try out, and see if it's right for you. So again, go down below, click that link, and get started today. So we did the boot speed test. Now we need to actually get some background real quick of what's going on here. macOS obviously pre-installed their operating system, their hardware. Life is good. Granted, support for macOS on this machine is fading as it gets older and older, so do note that. And you probably noticed in the boot speed test, I'm running Windows 10. Windows 11 isn't technically supported because through Boot Camp, Windows 10 is the only option. There are ways to get around that, but it was kind of hacky and I had a little bit of trouble, mostly because of Windows garbage implementation of the TPM drivers, or the requirement for a TPM security chip. Now Linux is a little bit more complicated because these machines have the T2 security chip, which does make it a little bit difficult to install or get some of the drivers and firmware that you need to run Linux on these machines. Luckily, there is a whole project called T2 Linux, which actually has a few different distros that have a custom compiled kernel specifically for this hardware, as well as scripts and steps to go ahead and pull your firmware and drivers directly from macOS that's also installed on the system to your Linux partition. So if you are interested, if you have an old MacBook laying around, I will link to this down below if you're interested. And on this thing, I didn't do any like special battery optimization for the Linux system, and that kind of shows in my battery testing. For this, just like that tablet we looked at, I just put a full screen window of the default web browser, Edge on Windows, Firefox on Linux, and Safari on macOS. And this is where we had a very large kind of macOS victory. Their battery optimization is much better than the other operating systems. I took score at the 100 to 50%, 40, 30, 10, 25, and these are the minutes of how long it took. So going from 100 to 50%, we had over an hour better macOS battery life compared to Windows, and Linux just did not do that good. Less than an hour it took to go from 100 to 50%. And going from 100 to 5%, Linux didn't even put out a whole 2 hours of battery life because we're at 97 minutes there. macOS had just about hour battery life compared to Windows, going from 100 to 5%. For this test, I set at 100% brightness, about 25% audio output. I could probably get a little bit better battery out of Linux if I did some like extra work, optimization, kind of played around with it a bit, but with how big the differences are, it would probably still lose. Now from there, we loaded up Geekbench 6. This is a pretty standard test that I run quite a bit, which Geekbench is awesome because not only do we get kind of general single and multi-core scores, but I'll link to the full results where you can see kind of specific category or specific tests that were run to get to this score. And in this case, we have a Ubuntu victory. Linux did perform better in Geekbench. It beat out macOS by just about 400 points and beat out Windows by just about 1,000 points on multi-core score. Single was a little tighter, especially when you compare macOS and Windows, as that's kind of within the margin of error on single core score, but Ubuntu did have nearly 100-point advantage over the other two. So at least on this test, Ubuntu gives the kernel's optimized pretty well for this hardware. From there, I tested out Novabench. Now, there are less kind of individual tests ran during this process for these specific categories, but this one gives us a whole general look at our computer, including CPU, GPU, memory, and storage scores. And here, macOS still did not well, while Windows actually took the advantage over Linux by about 300 points, but this was really surprising how macOS just did not perform. Looking at the GPU score, this is a macOS victory at 225 versus Windows at 210, and Ubuntu did the worst in this test at 200. I'm going to skip memory real quick and go to the storage score. This is the actual kind of read-write speeds on the root file partition here, and macOS did win in this one at 280 versus Windows at 270 and Ubuntu at 256. Now memory score, this had a weird thing go on where macOS lost this one just barely to Windows at 267 versus 274, but for some reason Ubuntu scored so high that I didn't really believe it, scoring 423. Granted, I am a Linux fanboy. If I wish I could just take this result for what it is and say, whoa. But to kind of test this out, I loaded up a tool called Cinebench, which has its own memory test, and this is compatible with Linux and Mac OS. It's Unix. There's a lot of cross compatibility there. And then for this, I did Cinebench test memory threads for run, and we could see some of the results here. Looking at the transfer speed, Ubuntu is still in the lead, but not at the margins that we saw at the previous test, so I can still call the memory performance a definite Linux winner, but it's not as dramatic as we saw in Novabench. Now, Cinebench, they don't have a version for Linux, but I did want to kind of test Mac and Windows against each other in this, because Cinebench is another really common benchmarking tool, this one being the R23 version. And in this one, macOS actually did win the CPU score, which this is like a kind of graphical renderer using the CPU, so it really depends on what the operating system is trying to do, and which is where we see differences in these scores, because it is a pretty dramatic difference. We have 9,000 for macOS and just under 8,000 for Windows, a whole 1,000-point difference being out of the margin of error. So for graphics rendering and things like that, using that Intel CPU, macOS seems to be doing pretty good. Now, speaking of graphics, I did run some graphics tests. There's not very many games or anything like that that are cross-compatible on all three that I at least feel like playing and testing. But going back to Geekbench, they do actually have a GPU test that you can run. This one, it depended on the platform what tests were actually available. So you could see here, for example, on Ubuntu, the only thing we could run is the Vulkan test. macOS, the only thing was Metal, which I think is still Vulkan, but I'm not 100% on that. We could run OpenCL on both Windows and macOS. When it comes to OpenCL, Windows absolutely destroyed macOS. When it comes to Vulkan, Ubuntu, goddamn, scoring 46,000, so rather impressive score, and macOS on Metal scored 37,000. So if you take all these numbers, Linux is the clear winner at 46. Now, another kind of cross-compatible benchmarking tool is Valley Benchmark. This is one of the few ones that works specifically with this version of macOS, Windows, and Linux. And in this one, we have a pretty good kind of distribution here. macOS and OpenGL dominated, well, not dominated, about 400-point difference. So enough where it's out of a margin of error against Windows and Ubuntu, which I do have to note, Ubuntu was the lowest score out of this. So do note that. But then if you go ahead and throw a DirectX test, which Windows just always does kind of better at, it beats everything at 3,800, almost 3,900, versus macOS's OpenGL score of 3,500. And nowadays, even myself, I find just about almost everything, maybe 90% of everything I do is within a web browser. So that is almost kind of the most important thing that you need to look at. And for this, I tested 2 different browsers on all the operating systems and Safari on macOS. We have Firefox, Edge, and Safari. And the first test we ran was Basemark Web 3.0. Within macOS itself, Firefox scored the best, even beating out Safari by just under 100 points. Edge did not do very well at all. And then in Windows, Firefox and Edge was a near tie with a slight Edge advantage, and in Ubuntu, it was flipped with Firefox getting the advantage. Now, looking at it the other way, Ubuntu was a clear victor when it comes to Basemark Web 3.0, scoring average 1,300 versus just about 1,100 on Windows, and kind of a net average of 800 points throughout the macOS operating system. And then another browser benchmark test, which is one of my favorites because it does a lot of tests that kind of more relate to actual use cases, whether that be like uploading receipts, working in spreadsheets, things like that, doing some photo manipulation, and that is WebXPRT 4. Results on this one were a little bit tighter than we saw in the previous one, with the best performer out of all of these being Firefox on Ubuntu with a score of 215, and the worst performer, which was a huge shock to me, and I did run these tests multiple times under multiple environments. This is kind of like the averages that I got. And that was Edge on Windows 10, scored 185, the lowest score, only second to Firefox on Windows, which scored 190. So Linux is a powerhouse at web browsing, which, I mean, if everything you do is in a web browser, you might as well try out Linux. I mean, it's definitely worth the experiment. So those are the results. You can see here I have a GitHub page that has just about everything on it, all the different tests, the graphs, fun stuff. So I'll link to this down below if you want to. And if you go in here, for example, Geekbench 6, if I click on one of these results, it will take you directly to that result page. So then you can better see some of the results we got on these specific tests within the whole benchmark, such as photo library, PDF render, HTML5 browser. So you can kind of compare those yourself if you want to, if you're looking for a real specific score on a specific test. Now, in the near future, when possible, I want to do these same tests on Apple Silicon, which is a dream. It truly is wonderful. I'm not trying to simp too hard, but I've talked about this in the past. Getting like a M1 MacBook Air is a wonderful value. And even this, I'm recording this on the new Mac Mini, the M4 Mac Mini, just the base model. It's a phenomenal computer. Switching away from Intel and working on their own CPUs is one of the best things Apple has ever done. And these tests kind of show that, and do subscribe because I will be getting the version of Linux that works with these M1s or the Apple Silicon CPUs and testing it up against at least macOS and maybe Windows. I have to look a little bit more into how to get that installed. So again, everything I mentioned will be down below. If there's some benchmarks or tests that's cross-compatible on everything that you wish I would have included, please let me know down below. I'm going to be doing more of these kind of benchmark tests, so I want to get a good kind of layout of tools to continue to do this. And with all that, I do hope you have an absolutely beautiful day, and goodbye.